what is the difference between canon and legends? How do we keep it all straight? Is the Bad Batch canon? What about Bane? What about Thrawn? And what does canon even mean in the first place? Well, let's figure it out. I'm Eric, welcome to Youtini, and today we're going to teach you one of the most important lessons about navigating the Star Wars universe. You probably know someone who has had trouble reading Star Wars books, and it makes sense, it can be very confusing. I mean, sure, you've seen the films and maybe even some of the shows, but the second you walk into that Barnes & Noble and make your way over to the Star Wars section, all bets are off. Because depending on the book you choose, you can pick wildly different timelines. Let's say you know Thrawn from Rebels or Ahsoka. That's great. He's on the cover of this book, and they're talking about Tarkin and the Empire. But on this other book, Palpatine is already dead, and wait, Leia is pregnant with twins? I thought there was one kid. And then back onto the shelf they go, and out the door goes another potential Star Wars reader who just needs a bit of help to get started. And that is exactly why we're here today. In order to understand the two continuities of Star Wars, canon and legends, we're going to start off with a brief history of Star Wars publishing, because it's important to understand why this whole thing is a bit confusing. And once we have that foundation, we'll dive into the specifics and get you on your way to mastering this concept and Star Wars reading as a whole. It may not surprise you that Star Wars books are almost as old as Star Wars itself. Just 1 year after A New Hope was released, and when it was still in theaters, we got Splinter of the Mind's Eye by Alan Dean Foster. Now, if you go back and read this now, it is absolutely wild for a number of reasons, but chief among them is that this was essentially the blueprint for the made-for-TV sequel if Lucas couldn't get the Empire greenlit. Thankfully, that wasn't an issue. Now, from there, Star Wars fans received a number of additional books, like Brian Daley's Han Solo trilogy, and a few other key additions we'll discuss later on in this video. But for now, all you need to know is that Star Wars books kept releasing pretty continuously all the way up until 2012, when the future of the franchise changed forever with the Disney acquisition. Now, there were a plethora of reasons why George Lucas decided to hand the reins over to his beloved franchise, and we'll probably cover them in a later video in more detail. But for our purposes today, this event is so important because of the decision that was made as a result: the solidification of the Star Wars canon. This was a pretty massive deal, because while all of the stories that had been published in the years leading up to this had occurred in relatively the same continuity, they didn't have the strictest oversight. Even Lucas himself didn't consider a number of the published works official, but with one stroke of the pen, Disney decided that's the direction they wanted, and they went ahead with full steam. But did that mean that Disney decided to immediately unpublish all of the previous stories or lock them in the Disney vault? Absolutely not. They knew the love and passion that these stories had inspired over the decades, so in order to honor those stories while establishing this new official continuity, they came up with a compromise. They decided to simply call them legends. And thus was the dichotomy born: canon and legends. Now, in order to really understand the difference and how they affect your reading journey going forward, let's get into each of these with a bit more specificity, starting with canon. Canon is the blanket term for everything that officially happened in the current Star Wars continuity. So what all does that include? Well, let's start with the films, because that's the easy answer. All of them. Episodes 1 through 9, Rogue One, and Solo. They're all canon. Now, technically, there are some really old films that aren't canon, like the Ewok films, but there's a pretty good chance you'd never heard of those anyway. That being said, they are on Disney+, so watch at your own risk. And then we have the TV shows. Another easy answer, because pretty much all of those are canon as well. We have animated shows like The Clone Wars, Rebels, and Resistance, live action shows like The Mandalorian, Ahsoka, and The Acolyte, and even kids shows like Young Jedi Adventures are technically canon. Now again, we have a few small exceptions here that fall outside of canon, most notably the 2D Clone Wars series from Genndy Tartakovsky. This was a fan favorite show, but I'm afraid it just missed the cut. And as for the Lego specials that come out from time to time, I'm not sure that Vader and Palpatine ever canonically hung out on the beach. They're pretty fun nonetheless. But the most important part of this, and likely why you're here, is the books and comics. Now, starting off with the books, we have another pretty easy blanket answer. Every book published after September of 2014 is canon. The first book to fall under this new system was A New Dawn by John Jackson Miller, and everything after that is technically part of the Star Wars canon. Now, 2014 was a pretty tumultuous time for Star Wars books, it's true, and a couple titles did get caught in the crossfire. Joe Schreiber's Maul Lockdown got released in January and is now a Legends title, as is James S.A. Corey's Honor Among Thieves, the Han Solo heist tale, which came out in March. But the dust did eventually settle, the line was drawn, and every other book published in 2014 and beyond is canon. And this doesn't just apply to books surrounding the time periods of the films, the entirety of the High Republic. The publishing initiative that has stories that predate the Phantom Menace is canon, as is the show taking place in that era, The Acolyte. Because remember, all the TV shows are still canon, despite what some folks might say. Now, when we look at comics, a very similar rule applies. In 2015, Star Wars relaunched their comic line with Marvel with Star Wars #1 from Jason Aaron and John Cassaday. And for the most part, everything published since is canon. There are a few rare exceptions that pop up from time to time, but the rule of thumb is more than enough to set you on the right path. And of course, there's one more category that is becoming more and more prevalent in Star Wars entertainment: video games. All the campaigns in modern Star Wars multiplayer games, like Battlefront 2 from 2017 and Star Wars Squadrons, they're all canon, as are games like Jedi Fallen Order, Jedi Survivor, and Star Wars Outlaws. And while we may see references to older LucasArts games littered throughout the modern stories, games that predate the canon, like Knights of the Old Republic and Jedi Academy, no longer have that distinction. So with all of these lines drawn, why is canon so important? Why did they do this? Well, because nowadays, if you see something happen in one piece of media, it means that it happened in all the others as well. It reinforces the nature of the shared Star Wars universe. And in addition to alleviating confusion and contradiction, it allows creators to all play in the same sandbox together at the same time, creating fuller, richer stories because of it. Now, is the system perfect? Not 100% of the time. There are a few issues that arise from time to time, and sometimes creative solutions or retcons are required. But they definitely do their best to help us keep track of what's going on in the massive, wonderful history of our favorite galaxy. But speaking of history, it's time to move over to the second part of this fierce dichotomy: Legends. Legends, formerly known as the EU or Expanded Universe, has an intensely rich history dating all the way back to the aforementioned Splinter of the Mind's Eye. And even though there are a few healthy contradictions from time to time, like Yoda being blue in the Empire Strikes Back novelization, or Shakti dying 5 different times across her Legends tenure, they're still wonderful stories. Now, as you might have guessed, the rule of thumb for Legends is simply the exact opposite of canon. All stories outside of the films that occurred mostly in print media between 1977 and 2014 are Legends. Some of the most famous examples of these are Timothy Zahn's original Thrawn trilogy, starting with Heir to the Empire, Drew Karpyshyn's Darth Bane trilogy, and John Jackson Miller's Kenobi. All these are phenomenal stories with complex character arcs and tons of Star Wars lore, and they all now carry the title of Legends. Which leads to one of the questions that I hear all the time from Star Wars readers. Does Legends even matter anymore? Does the acquisition mean that none of these stories happened and it's all a waste of time? Well, while that's a bigger question for a future video, let's give the simple answer here. Yes, they still matter. No, they're not a waste of time. And as to whether or not they still happened, well, that's a solid maybe. Because there are plenty of Legend stories that happened in parts of the galaxy or timeline that canon hasn't touched yet. So if they haven't been written over, who's to say they haven't happened? After all, every culture has their own myths, their own apocrypha, their own legends. And whether or not every plot point of those stories is 100% accurate, that does not diminish their value. Now, for your reading purposes, modern printings have made the distinction between canon and legends very simple by the addition of this helpful golden banner. On every new printing since 2014, Legends titles have featured this logo emblazoned on the cover, so you'll always know if you're reading a story in this continuity. And if you have an older or original copy of the story that doesn't have the banner and you want to be sure, simply double check if the published date is pre-2014, and boom, you're in Legends. Additionally, Penguin Random House has been reprinting a ton of Legend stories into what they've called the Essential Legends Collection, which not only reprints some classic stories into fantastic new trade paperbacks, but also feature brand new cover art right below the new golden banner. Truly the easiest way to catch up on Legends if you're dipping your toe in for the first time. Now that we have a firm grasp on what defines canon and what defines Legends, let's circle back to something we briefly mentioned at the top of the video: crossovers. Because over the years, we've seen quite a few pieces of Legends make their way into canon, so what does that mean for both continuities? Well, let's tackle that by looking at the most obvious example, Thrawn. Thrawn was originally introduced to Star Wars in 1991's Heir to the Empire, the beginning of a trilogy that now falls firmly into the Legends camp. But back in 2017, he was reintroduced to canon books with Thrawn, which told a slightly different story. So how did that work? Well, for starters, Disney brought back Timothy Zahn, Thrawn's original creator, to tell his new story in order to maintain the voice and characteristics of the character, a theme you'll see more often than not when it comes to Legends crossovers. And secondly, even though Thrawn's story in canon has plenty of differences from the Legends tale, there are homages constantly thrown in, from his right-hand assassin, to his main ship, to his trademark love of the word perhaps. At the end of the day, his original Legends material is clearly respected by the current creators of the saga, and that type of respect continues every time Legends material pops up in canon. After all, the Night Sisters first arrived in the courtship of Princess Leia before we saw them in the Clone Wars, and Cortosis, the metal that finally made its way on screen thanks to the Acolyte, first appeared in I, Jedi and the Darth Bane trilogy. It's these types of crossovers regarding lore and character that continually reinforce the bond between the entire mythology of Star Wars. So we can see that Legends remains not only a set of fantastic stories, but also an almost endless well that can supply future stories with characters, worlds, and anything else you can imagine. Now, all of this understanding is well and good, but it doesn't really mean a whole lot without some practical steps and resources to help your journey get started. As we said earlier, your easiest tool to distinguish between canon and Legends is gonna be the banner test. But if you want more specifics about when a book was published, you can check out our publishing order over on our site. And if you want to go even further, you can check out our canon and Legends timelines, which not only tell you which continuity you're reading, but also where your story falls in the timeline of the greater galactic saga. And finally, if you just want some straight up recommendations for where to go first, well, that's the advice I never get tired of giving. If you're new to Star Wars books, I highly recommend our Youtini Essential 6. 6 books that span both canon and Legends and offer the best quality and accessibility you can find. On the other hand, if you just want to jump directly into canon, why not try Lost Stars by Claudia Gray? An original story that covers the timeline of the original trilogy with brand new eyes and one of the best love stories you'll ever read. Or for our Legends fans, you can't go wrong with John Jackson Miller's Kenobi, a Western that connects General Kenobi to Old Ben by showcasing Obi-Wan's adventures on Tatooine, and a massive inspiration for the canon miniseries. Regardless of the direction you want to take, there are no wrong answers, and we have guides for everything you can imagine over on our site. Links, as always, are all in the description down below. When the Disney acquisition created the idea of Legends, many fans were frustrated. There was a fear that their years of dedication to the expanded universe had been wasted, and this new corporation was telling them that their stories didn't matter anymore. But that couldn't be further from the truth. By separating the universes of Legends and canon, Star Wars has effectively created 2 full continuities, full stories for fans to enjoy. There's no right or wrong, you can jump back and forth as often as you like, and the only rules are to know which timeline you're in at the moment, and to treat every reader, no matter their preference, with the utmost respect. With those lessons in hand, you're in for the ride of your life. Until next time, may the Force be with you.